Are these stoves masonry stoves or rocket stoves? And of course, you guys know the answer. But it was fun to think about how to explain this to someone who really doesn't have, you know, much of a background in this stuff. And of course, we all know, I think, that the answer is, well, it's both, right? It's a masonry stove. It's a masonry stove because we're using a quick hot fire to heat thermal mass, in this case masonry, for later release. So we have thermal storage, quick hot fire in the interest of burning clean and efficiently, and thermal storage for the interest of long, even heating cycles. That's essentially what a masonry stove is. Masonry stoves typically have fireboxes on the front end that do burn hot and fast, but that doesn't mean they were all rocket stoves, because a rocket stove really is a pretty specific thing too, right? It has a certain set of parameters that provide passive draft and a passive blower type combustion is what I call it. You know, air moving rapidly through a turbulent zone to create turbulence in an area where there's high temperature for a certain amount of time, and you get that rocket type combustion. Now that's very different than, you know, just big fireboxes and a lot of masonry stoves that kind of just burn straight upwards, and then they just kind of run those hot gases through chimneys. Those are masonry stoves that have a firebox in front, but they don't really have a rocket stove component. So what I say to someone who says, you know, is it a masonry stove or a rocket stove? I say it's both. It's a masonry stove using rocket combustion principles, rocket stove combustion principles. Now, one of the things that trips people up is that a lot of the rocket stoves that they see, as a matter of fact, most people's experiences with rocket stoves is like a 3-inch or a 2-inch little K, you know, the world's crappiest shape for a rocket stove, but all the metal ones seem to come that way. So all these guys building, you know, rocket stoves out of metal tubing, which I did too, my very first one. I'm not picking on these people, but it's just sort of my first rocket stove, right? You know, you find some square tubing or round tubing and you weld them together and you fire sheets out the top, and it's really cool. So most folks, that's what they think of when they think of rocket stoves. So when they see something that looks like a firebox and I load real pieces of firewood in it, that was another part of this question, or this customer's question, when he said, is it a masonry stove or a rocket stove? You seem to be putting in a lot of wood compared to the rocket stoves I've seen where they burn twigs. And so then I have to kind of go a little ways down the system size discussion, because obviously a stove that's designed for a 6-inch chimney is really different than the little cooking stoves and the Lorena stoves and you know, the stoves that typically have, you know, risers of like 2 or 3-inch diameter, and they put a pot on top and boil their water or whatever, and they use twigs, and that is a rocket stove, but it's very different than what we're using here. So that kind of brings us all the way around though to, okay, so they're masonry stoves. How are they different from the other masonry stoves? Well, we use rocket stove combustion, which is fairly modern. There's obviously older examples of it, but it's been refined in the last few decades to reach a level of combustion efficiency that really previously is fairly unknown in passive burning systems. That isn't saying no one's ever done it before. I think rocket stoves have probably been invented throughout the millennia over and over again. You know, the Dakota fire pit's a good example. But for the most part, humans are kind of dumb, and we end up somehow at a place in time like in the 1800s when Ben Franklin can put fire in a metal box, and people think, you know, that the Franklin stove is some amazing piece of modern technology. You know, obviously I don't feel that way. It's like it's really, really horrible combustion, and I think we've done better at other times in history. But nonetheless, in the modern world, the rocket stove combustion core does represent a fairly modern departure in terms of combustion efficiency from traditional wood burning fireboxes. And so most traditional masonry stoves, masonry heaters, have pretty poor efficiency with regards to their front end fireboxes. Now, one thing you'll see is that the proponents of masonry stoves traditionally would say we can harvest 90% of the heat created by the fire. So they talk about efficiency in the 90 percentages, but they're only talking about heat created and heat saved. Whereas with rocket stoves, when we say 90%, we're talking about potential heat within the fuel. Very different ways of measuring, right? Where the original masonry stoves, they didn't worry too much about how efficiently the wood burned. They worried about how efficiently they used the heat that was made from burning. And often those fires were terribly smoky, inefficient fires, but they used the heat very efficiently. So, there's, hopefully that illustrates a little bit that what we're doing now is we're burning the combustion core with much higher efficiency and much more cleanliness. We're running much less smoke and creosote through the stoves, putting much less particulate in the air, so we can achieve much higher efficiencies than a masonry stove of 100 years ago or whatever. Now, is that to say the rocket stove cores are the only efficient ones? It's not. There have been other people making advances in combustion, and there are some pretty neat masonry stove combustion cores out there that don't really qualify as rockets but still achieve pretty incredible efficiency numbers. Unfortunately, most of them are really incredibly complex to build. The Eco Box, which is Richard Ussel's Eco Firebox, I think it's an ASTM recognized efficient. I'm gonna get my certifications wrong, but it's a European certified, super high efficiency masonry stove firebox. Really neat firebox, but beyond what we could even probably convey to people to build with plans. Really specific air slotting in lots of locations, and yeah, just pretty complex. So at any rate, our stoves are rocket stoves and masonry heaters, and in my opinion, they are the most modern version of masonry heaters because they feature an incredibly modern combustion core. So I think probably one of the main things I wanted to go over, just to kind of set the tone for that and to go back to my last discussion, was the definition of a masonry heater. So it's something that we probably should all know anyways. So ASTM, the certification certifying body, defines a masonry heater in its international language as, quote, a vented heating system of predominantly masonry construction having a mass of at least 800 kilograms, 1,700 pounds, 1,760 pounds, excluding the chimney and masonry heater base. So the weight of 800 kilograms excluding the chimney and base. In particular, a masonry heater is designed specifically to capture and store a substantial portion of the heat energy from a solid fuel fire in the mass of the masonry heater through internal heat exchange flue channels, enabling a charge of solid fuel mixed with an adequate amount of air to burn rapidly and more completely at high temperatures in order to reduce emission of unburned hydrocarbons and be constructed of sufficient mass and surface area such that under normal operating conditions, the external surface temperatures of the masonry heater, except in the region immediately surrounding the fuel loading doors, does not exceed 110 Celsius or 230 degrees Fahrenheit. So pretty detailed definition. You can kind of break it down into vented heating system for solid fuel, having a mass of 800 kilograms, designed to burn rapidly and store heat for longer cycles, and the skin doesn't get over 230 degrees. Something like that. So I thought that was really interesting because really, our rocket stove powered masonry heaters fit that definition to a T, and I would even say they are even, more so. We've been more concerned with this part. Charged solid fuel mixed with adequate amount of air to burn rapidly and more completely at high temperatures in order to reduce emission of unburned hydrocarbons. That's, really been the prime focus of the rocket stove, rocket mass heater movement. Whereas with masonry heaters, some builders, I will absolutely, give credit where credit's due. Many, especially modern builders, that is one of their prime goals. But traditionally it wasn't. And when we look at the history of masonry heaters, we'll see that. There are masonry heaters throughout history where people sometimes thought that like burning hay, slow, small, smoky fires were best because it would the the space in the masonry slowly. And actually, one of my favorite masonry heaters is the I forget what it's called now, but the Civil War tent heater, the Crimean oven, as they referred to it. And again, they did try to, it seems like, have pretty hot fires, but most of them were fairly smoky as well. Just like there's a Spanish version called the Gloria of underfloor heating, and same thing.